We are going to get started with our talk with Will Ruth today. My name is Flavia DeLucas, and I work with US Rowing in Learning and Development, also known as Coaching Education. So whether you're certified or looking to get certified in the future, we'll definitely be in contact. And so I want to take a moment to introduce Will. Very excited to have him here with us today. Will Ruth, he is a strength coach for the Craftsbury Green Racing Project, which is a high performance sport program for post-collegiate rowers, cross-country skiers, biathletes, runners, as well as a summer U23 rowing and skiing program. Before he moved to Vermont in 2019, he was a strength coach and assistant for Western Washington University men's rowing team in Bellingham, Washington. He has a bachelor's in kinesiology, a master's in sports coaching, and he's a certified strength and conditioning specialist through the National Strength and Conditioning Association. He is also the author of the rowingstronger.com website and the Rowing Stronger book, with lots of resources and information about strength training for rowers of all ages, types, and levels. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Will to talk about preseason and in-season strength training.
All right, thanks for the intro, Flavia. Get over here. I have a lot to cover, so I'm going to jump right in. If I do a good job, we'll have at least 10 minutes for questions at the end. I have several slides in here that are more for your reference later, like program templates that I'm not going to go into in total detail. So make sure to download the slides on Sketch, and you'll get those links and everything else for reference later. So here's what we're going to cover today. We will do a brief review of the basics because your off season sets up your in season. And just like in rowing, we have to talk about rowers and programs differently if we get a fall, winter, and spring versus if most or all of our rowers are spring only. So we'll go through a few things briefly, and then I've got references for more if you need more on that as well. Then I'll spend most of my time talking about this preseason phase that we're in now or beginning shortly, depending on your exact rowing timeline, and how we use the preseason phase to shift to power focus with plyometric exercise and explosive tempo strength training. If we have built up from the off season through the preseason, then the in season is just about at least maintaining our strength training qualities while making room for increased sport training. So I call this maintain plus because some athletes are going to keep gaining through the in season as long as we're focusing our strength training efforts on force, power, muscle, and coordination, not wasting time with strength endurance training that they're already getting plenty of from rowing and erging. So to go into some of our basics here, this is the periodization overview of what kind of our whole year looks like if we have a full year with athletes. We don't always, so we'll make some compromises as needed. Like I mentioned, if we only have a preseason phase or if we only have an in-season phase, I'll address that in a moment. Periodization really just means a system of organizing training so that we develop qualities in a sequential order instead of trying to train everything to a peak all at once. For example, from a strength training perspective, we can't teach athletes the lifts to improve coordination and do a bunch of reps for general strength and muscle mass development and increase rate of force production with power training and also have enough time for rowing, erging, and racing. So we have to break this down and kind of pick the 1 to 2 most important things from each phase that we want to focus on while we move the other qualities to maintenance. So like I said here, if you only see your rowers for one focused season, maybe that's because they're multi-sport athletes or because that's just what we have, then we have to make some significant compromises to avoid trying to pack all that development into just a few months. This might also apply later on in the presentation if you have off-season or preseason strength training in a gym, but then our boathouse only in season, you're sort of back to this more minimalist mode. And I think that the important things to do in this situation are use the limited amount of training time to do what rowing and erging doesn't. So don't double down kind of on the redundant stimulus of more kind of endurance work, body weight circuits, that kind of stuff. Teach movements and improve coordination quality because that's ultimately what's going to keep athletes healthy and transfer to performance. I sort of think about like our power movers of being the legs and the back and the upper body and the things that really contribute to stroke force. The areas that I want to focus on in a minimalist design are the transfer sites. So in between those, the hip, the shoulder, and the core, if we're generating a lot of force at the foot plate, That all has to go through a very long kinetic chain to actually get through to the handle. So I really focus on those areas more in a minimalist design. And my go-to approach in this situation has been either 2 to 3 sessions per week of 30, 30 for 30 circuits using basic exercises focused on coordination and strength training for mostly those hip, shoulder, core transfer areas. And there's the 30 for 30 for 30 is 30 seconds on, 30 seconds off for 30 minutes total. And so I just said like an emphasis not on high rep muscle endurance bodyweight circuits. The balanced work to rest ratio of the 30 on and the 30 off and the limited total duration of 30 minutes really keeps us much more focused on the basic kind of coordination skills and strength training, and gets less into the kind of fatigue zone like we see with more of our endurance design. So I have several banks of different 30 30 for 30 circuits that I use. I like it to come out clean, but it doesn't have to. So I like to use 5 rounds of 6 exercises or 6 rounds of 5 exercises, sometimes 3 rounds of 10 exercises. And I've got banks of all that available if you click on that link through the slide PDFs. Now, if we can't dedicate 2 to 3 sessions of 30 minutes per week, then I make sure that we have at least a 10 to 15 minute land warm up that incorporates the major movements. So this both helps rowers feel primed and ready to learn and perform on water. So we get a boost out of the subsequent rowing and erging that we do. It also introduces them or helps at least maintain some of those very basic strength training skills. So I have some examples of a full body warm up that I could talk about more, but really we just want to work through the full kinetic chain. So start at the ankles, work our way up to the shoulders and the hands, and practice all the movements in between those. So we'll do something for the legs, something for the back, something for the core, something for the hips, the shoulder. You get the idea. We pick stuff that works based on the setting for the athlete with the equipment that we have access to. And I think that's kind of like the bare minimum that I want to be able to get done, is focus on those transfer sites and then try to teach movement quality and retain the basic coordination of those larger compound strength training movements. If we see rowers for more than one season, then we get some off-season time to develop the fundamentals. So again, this is a brief review. If you need more information, you can follow the link over there on the bottom right side to my Basics of Strength Training for Rowing article, where I cover all this in detail. But just to go through this briefly, we focus on teaching the basic movements of the squat, hinge, push, and pull. Then we hit the transfer areas of hip, shoulder, and core. I have a bunch of pictures of these exercises and links to video demos too in the addendum of these slides that you can reference later if you want some examples of different exercises that you can do. But that's kind of like the big things that we're always working on in strength training. Major movements, squat, hinge, push, pull, fill the gaps in between with minor movements for the hip, the shoulder, and the core. Then I'm always coaching 3 major things in the gym with rowers from juniors to masters, and our GRP U23 rowers and our senior team rowers as well. Good technique, good movement transfers to the sport. Bad movement fails to transfer or even conflicts. So we don't want to get sloppy with our technique just in order to get more reps or more load. We always want to maintain good technique as our base and then add strain and strength from there. For tempo, I really work a lot on controlling the lowering phase and accelerating the lifting phase of exercises. So we think about 2 down, 1 up, or the 2-1 tempo is our default setting. And we train that all off season so that we can add a twist in the preseason. I kind of connect that to the rowing movement too. So if we want to think about like slide control, if we have rowers dropping to the bottom position of squats and then grinding the lifting side of the squat, what are they probably going to do when they get back in the boat? Flap the slide, not have enough acceleration on the drive phase. So we want to keep that kind of rhythmically similar. And then for range of motion, rowing is a long range of motion sport. So we're always training full range of motion. We don't want to shorten up just to add more reps or more load. So that's mostly relevant for squats, but also for push-ups, other push exercises. We want to be getting the chest all the way down to the floor. On pulls, we want to get to full retraction points. So there's a lot of different kind of cues that I use that all come around to like how we can maintain full range of motion for the athletes so we're getting the most benefit for rowing. And then here's my basic strength training template. This is mostly for your reference later. as an example of most of my strength training programs. And this is also in the basics of strength training article with details of how to exactly to read it and use it. And I'll come back to this template later in the presentation for preseason and in-season adaptations specifically, but just wanted to leave this like this is probably 80% of my strength training programs all look something like this, and then with variations based on whether we want to be on the lower side of the sets and reps or the higher side of the sets and reps. There are a lot of different variations from there as far as which exercises we pick specifically, but it all kind of comes back to this um, basic basic system. All right. So that's, like I said, a quick review of the fundamentals. From here, we're going to talk about the main thing for this presentation, which is the preseason phase and the in-season phase. So if we've been doing all that in the off season, then we're ready for the preseason and then the in-season after that. But I think about for the preseason, we either catch up or we ramp up. So if we only see rowers in the preseason and the in-season, kind of, for example, the classic like winter training into spring rowing junior schedule, then we'll use the preseason basically more as the off season, and we'll catch up on teaching the fundamentals and building the general strength and coordination that we need in order to go to the next level. If we've had a fall off season or a longer winter season, maybe we started in November or something after Thanksgiving, we've been able to build through instead of starting like after winter break or in January. Um, then we can do the off-season fundamentals then, and then right about this time of the year in January or February, then we can take that coordination and base strength that the athletes have built, and we can start increasing intensity and building up to a peak before the in-season phase. So that's kind of how I look at it. We're either catching up or ramping up during this time of the year, depending on what our athletes need. This is a quick visualization of the major strength training qualities and how their emphasis changes from one phase to the next. I've tried to provide some sort of definitions of these terms in italics, but maybe we can go back to this later if we have time. In our What I want to just show is, again, how the emphasis changes from one phase to the next. So in our off-season phase, we're doing generally higher total sets and reps. So in our basic template, we'd be more on the high side, as long as that's appropriate for the athletes. And because we're doing more volume, we're going to be lower intensity. Think about this in the same terms as rowing, just with meters or minutes and like proximity to race pace or the athlete's max. We add then rate of force production. We could also think about this in stroke rate if we're using similar rowing terms. In the off season, because we're doing higher volume, lower intensity training, we're also going to be less focused on rate of force production. So again, very, very, very similar to our year-round rowing model. When we go to the preseason phase, then we want to drop the volume down a little bit, which gives us room to increase the intensity to lift a little bit heavier weights and then also increase our rate of force production. One way that we increase the rate of force production and intensity is with full explosive intent power training work. We're going to keep the same 2-second lowering phase from the off season, but now we're accelerating explosively on the lifting phase with lower reps and a slightly heavier weight. So this is where I start to diverge from maybe the more traditionalist rowing model that has the reps going up and up and up throughout the year. I go the other way because of the reason I'm going to talk about in the in-season phase, and I start bringing the reps down, giving the athlete room to ramp up on the water or on the ergs, and really focusing on rate of force production. So we have our force velocity curve here with max strength and slow velocity on the far left side, and then max speed and max velocity with low force on the far right side. So basically, in our off-season phase, we're going to spend more time sort of here in the maximal strength, higher force phase. Then we're going to move down into this middle zone with the 2x tempo. So like I said, same controlled lowering phase, more accelerated lifting phase. For example, we'll do sets of 2 to 4 reps with a weight that we would typically use for 6 to 8 reps with our normal 2-1 tempo. So we're going to control lower, accelerated lift, and then leave it before the athlete starts to fatigue much. With the GRP teams, we use velocity-based training. And I know that this is something that many college programs have access to now as well. It's sort of like reasonably affordable for those with larger budgets. It's not totally in the stratosphere like it used to be. but it is still kind of outside the reach of, I think, most programs. So I'll just mention this here because, especially with like our U23 athletes who came to Craftsbury in the summer, I started introducing this and they were like, oh, yeah, we have that in college, but like we don't use it. They don't use it with the endurance sports. They only use it with the sprint and power sports. It's just as relevant. So I want to just mention this briefly. Velocity-based training is a monitoring device that gives us feedback on the bar speed so that we can train this as an output and just adjust the load and the reps to achieve the target speed rather than always focusing on the load, which can kind of lead us into not necessarily the right qualities for rowers with the purpose of explosive power. I think everybody can watch this video though, and and see what the speed strength zone and the full explosive intent looks like for our squat and deadlift exercise. Because even without the velocity based data, this is what we're going for when we try to speed up the lower body for starts, power tens, and sprints. So let me play this, and you'll see the speeds come up there on the one side, showing that our rower here is in the speed zone. He's doing a really good job of controlling the lowering phase and then accelerating the lifting phase. So we don't always train with the data feedback. Sometimes we'll go without the data, but I want them to use this same idea. So I think people can take kind of what that looked like and think about applying that for the explosive tempo work. But I'll leave that for there. I am writing a series on velocity-based strength training for rowing. So if you want to read more about that, you can get that there. All right. Everyone can do plyos. And good plyos are something I think that every rower should be doing as we move from the off season to the preseason and in-season training phases. I realized while I was doing a lot of prep for this, and I just did a new video on plyometric exercises for rowers that took me about an hour of doing nonstop video demos to actually film, that we have about like over a dozen different plyo variations with just some very simple combinations. Because we can modify all of the factors that I have below here. So we could do 2-leg versus 1-leg. We could do a vertical jump or a broad jump. Vertical jump where we're just jumping up like the standard squat jump, or a broad jump where we're jumping forward. And then we can do, I think the twist that I add that a lot of rowers aren't familiar with is counter movement or non-counter movement jumps. And a counter movement jump is your standard squat jump where you squat down and immediately jump back up. Whereas a non-counter movement jump has a pause in the bottom position to let the downward momentum dissipate. And then we're going to jump without a stretch reflex. And so we're really working on that acceleration. So I think both are good for rowers. The seated jump is basically a super non-counter movement jump because the athlete starts out sitting on a box or a bench to start from a position of no momentum, and then they learn how to create leg drive while holding that same seated forward torso angle. So this is one of my go-tos for rowers in the preseason and in-season training phases. And then throws are great too when we have the space and equipment for them. We could do the backwards overhead throw as a counter movement or a non-counter movement throw by pausing or not pausing in that bottom position of the hinge. And this trains that long power chain in a very rowing relevant way. And then the forwards overhead throw can be also done counter movement or non-counter movement by pausing or not pausing in the bottom position of the squat. And this is more like a vertical jump, but with output at the hands as well. So good ways to just speed up the legs. All plyos offer benefit for training that fast nervous system output that we're ultimately going to want once we start going for more speed and sharper drives. A couple keys for plyometric exercises. We do plyos for coordination and full power output. So we do them 2 to 3 times a week. We pick 1 to 3 plyos per session, and we'll do them for 3 to 6 sets of 2 to 4 reps. And we have a 1 to 4 work to rest ratio. So if each set takes us maybe 10 seconds to do 2 or 3 jumps, then we're going to rest for at least 30 to 40 seconds in order to get the 1 to 4 work to rest ratio. An important thing is to teach and coach landing before jumping. So I had a lot of rowers with very heavy foot, flat foot landings, landing not in a good hinge position, but really kind of bent and curled forward. And that's not enhancing athleticism. So we really want that hinge position, even balance with foot pressure on the forefoot and the hind foot, and having the knees roughly in line with the toes, not bowed outwards or caved inwards. And we want to do plyos at the start of a session too. So our overall physical development priority is to go from power to strength and then to muscular hypertrophy work or aerobic development. We don't want to train power at the end when the athlete's fatigued. They're not actually training power. And here I have a couple plyo do not do's. They shouldn't be done daily because the athletes need to be able to absorb the force well. And we often get shin splints and lower body injuries when athletes try to jack up the plyo emphasis if they're not really prepared for that, especially rowers, since we don't have a landing component from the sport of rowing. If athletes have been on ergs all winter long, not doing any force absorption work, and they try to jump into doing daily plyos, definitely a recipe for shin splints, and potentially other knee pain and lower body injury. We don't do them for endurance because it's really just teaching the athlete how to conserve energy rather than to actually train for full power output, which is the point of plyometric exercise. And then we don't do them as punishment. I mean, I think coming back to Catherine's talk about professionalism in rowing and coaching, doing exercise as punishment is not professional. We're not actually helping athletes get better. We got to be careful about doing them on concrete boathouse floors, and this is obviously a challenge when that's what a lot of us are working with. But we got to have some sort of rubber mats or gymnastics mat. Soft top boxes work great, and if we don't have that, then we probably do more throws instead of jumps. But we need a safe landing surface so that the impact force of the ground is not too hard on athletes' lower bodies. We don't do them in a circuit because it's getting into the same high rep kind of endurance thing that the athletes are already getting from rowing and erging. So we don't need to have the increased impact and the fatigue on the athletes. And then, like I said, don't do them at the end of the session. We're not actually training power coordination at that point. We're just training fatigue tolerance. So this is all what I mean of like good plyos being very within reach here on the left side, training them for coordination and full power, following some kind of basic principles from the strength training side to develop explosive, coordinated athletes, not just to grind them down and be redundant with the training stimulus that they're already getting. So a couple things that I have in here, mostly for reference later. This is our preseason program template where I've highlighted in red like the main thing that we want to do is switch to that full explosive intent work strength training once we get into the preseason. If we've had the off season of building up, it's pretty simple to slot plyos into a strength training session. I'll just pair them with the first exercise of the day of our squat or deadlift lower body main work. So no need to rush, but I like to have the rower load the bar, do the jump or the throw, then hit their squat or deadlift set, and then rest. The plyo has a potentiating effect on the squat or deadlift when done this way. And then when we want to really focus on power, we'll do the squat and the deadlift for the same style. So we do power on the plyo, power on the squat and deadlift. But when we want more of a strength training emphasis or more of a strength emphasis still from our preseason phase, then we'll alternate sessions of this power focus and the strength focus. So on our next slide, this is my alternating week design where we have on week A, day one, focused on power and power with the plyo and the 2x tempo squatting. Then on the other day, we do still power for the plyo, but then we do our strength work for the hinge. And then on the next week, we reverse that. So we're making a shift toward power production, but we're not making the wholesale shift just yet to double power, focus, plyo, and lower body main exercise. All right. In the in-season phase, this is where I'll sort of talk about like how to choose which of those approaches because it really depends on what your in-season phase looks like. Here are a few key points for the in-season phase. The athlete availability is more important than their ability. So no matter what they could do in the gym, we got to have them be able to get out and row and do so consistently. So we can improve their strength training only so much as they're still able to go to their next practice and perform to their full potential. Like I said, maintain plus means that we're setting the expectation that we're at least going to get to the end of the season as strong and fit and muscular and healthy as we started the season. We're going to add speed through the rowing coaching side, and some athletes might gain as well. But if we just maintain, then we're taking 2 steps forward over the offseason and the preseason, no steps back during the in-season phase, another 2 steps forward in the next season. So we can continue to build on that through an athlete's multiple seasons, whole career from one year to the next, instead of what I see a lot, which is no plan to maintain. So then it's 2 steps forward, 2 steps back, 2 steps forward, 2 steps back. The athlete's never actually getting better in a long-term way. And it takes less work to maintain than to gain. So we can really be pretty conservative with what we do as long as we have some plan to continue doing it. And I've got a couple of templates for that too. Then finally, I subtract, not add, once we get into the in-season phase. So I want to really focus on the athlete's development through the off-season and the preseason. And then once we get to the in-season phase, I want to let the magic happen from the rowing coach side and just try to keep athletes healthy and maintain what they've built. On that note too, like tapering and peaking, I'm going to talk about this at the end, happens on water, not in the gym. So I don't do any intentional overreaching with the weights. I just try to support the athletes so that they can stay healthy and be ready to perform on the rowing side. This is back to our progression of strength elements. So in the in-season phase, we then drop the volume down from the preseason phase, keep the intensity pretty moderate. We're not doing light weights for strength endurance. We're also not doing max weights that are going to be potentially risky for the athletes. And we focus most on rate of force production. So that's here on the bottom right. Our rate then is fastest explosive lifting speeds because we want the athlete to really be ready for starts, sprints, and power tens. Okay, why we don't do strength endurance. So the modern rower trains endurance with rowing, erging, and cross training, and not with weights. All training has an opportunity cost, so more training isn't necessarily better. And I don't know many rowing coaches who would say I have time for everything. I've got time to burn actually. We have so much training time and we're on such a relaxed schedule that I could do whatever we want to do. So usually even with the GRP teams where we're dealing with residential athletes, they're doing such a high workload of rowing training that I don't have the time to spare either on the strength training side. So I've got to pick the things that are going to give us the most benefit with the least cost to the athletes. There's also injury risk from any form of training. That's part of the potential cost, and most injuries happen from inattention in the gym. So somebody walks into a bar or misloads a barbell or something like that. Those are where I've seen the worst injuries happen. But to the extent that they occur from intentional action, it's more often from overuse, from volume, than it is from focusing on lower volume, higher intensity, strength and power work. So the changing needs of modern rowing training are that modern rowers train more often, higher volume, and don't need the redundant stimulus in the gym. And then I think we also look at like the changing of equipment from the pre-1990s era that with hatchet blades, we increased strength demands on the athlete and also really shifted the power curve to an earlier peak and a higher peak, which means more lower body force emphasis. If you watched the boys in the boat rowing and you see that deep curl forward and deep lay back and really upper body emphasis, that's not how we row anymore because the equipment has changed so much. And then we also have ergs, which went from having, maybe you had a tank or an earlier ergometer or two in the boathouse in the pre-90s era to now, they're in every gym, every boathouse, and a lot of people's living rooms and garages too. So people are spinning the flywheel year round. Get your aerobic endurance exercise there and use strength training for strength, power, and staying healthy because that's where we're going to get the most bang for the buck. So a couple in-season considerations here. If we have a short versus a long racing season, this is part of how we're going to decide how we shape our preseason phase. So in a short racing season, let's say we have all of our important races within 4 to 6 weeks. So they're all kind of compressed within the end of, mid to late April and May. We could run the off season and preseason blocks longer and later, use the alternating week design to keep up the strength emphasis through the preseason phase. And then we build more earlier so we can coast more through the final weeks and races without having to worry about detraining and loss. If we have a longer racing season, like we have important races spread out over 8 to 12 weeks, or lots of seat racing that's going to happen earlier in the season that we want to keep athletes more fresh for, then the off season and preseason happen earlier to get the building done. No time to waste there. We got to get right on it as soon as we come out of January. We're making it through winter break. And then once we're in season, then we think in building and maintaining windows. So we build up when we can. If we have a weekend of no racing or no seat racing, then we can work the athlete a little harder in the gym. That means that then when we have busier weekends, then we can really back off and just focus on maintaining strength. Residual strength is that we can maintain strength for 2 to 3 weeks as long as our motor patterns are stable. So as long as athletes have good technique, they can go 2 to 3 weeks without doing heavy strength training and still maintain their strength pretty well. So we do that lighter power work in between to keep the motor patterns fresh. so that they're ready when we have an opportunity for more of a reset opportunity to do a heavier strength training session. So let's look back at our training template here with the in-season modifications. Same template, we just drop down the volume, make room for the sport increase. I've got here for our squat or for our deadlift that we're alternating our weeks, or we're doing the 2x tempo power work on both weeks. And then we still keep up doing the hip, shoulder, and core transfer work to fill gaps that we're not getting from doing all the rowing training. If we're not training those, then we're potentially regressing. And this is one kind of like more extreme diversion that I like. It's a one-on-one program where we it's a go-to for the hardest and busiest phases with a lot of weekend racing or intensive practicing. We get the loaded work done earlier in the week with lower volume, and then we do lighter work at the end of the week for movement quality, range of motion, and keeping athletes healthy. So kind of a template that you can come back to later. Let me talk just briefly about tapering, and then I'll have time for questions. I really use or think about two types of tapering here. The first type is a short taper, where we want the rower to just not feel sore and tired, but we're not really expecting much of like a performance benefit from it. So we use this for seat racing or local or regional events, but we don't give up much training time in order to dedicate to that. So we'll just basically take the second lift of the week off. We'll do the same lift earlier in the week, and then we have the event on the weekend, take the second one off, and then you feel good enough to be ready to go. The second type is a long taper, where we're going to gradually reduce the strength training stimulus over multiple weeks to facilitate recovery. So we start dropping down the athlete's fatigue from one week to the next. So here we got like week 0. This is our main peak event that we care about. And then week 1 is 1 week before that. Week 2 is 2 weeks before that. So we'll begin the taper on day 2 of week 2. And I've got a template for this on the next tab. So let me go over to that. Here, for example, we keep the same. This is a pretty normal session here, week 2, day 1, but then we start to drop down the volume first, and then the intensity after that. So we're just trying to gradually reduce the fatigue for the athlete without making a big shift. And this allows us to like keep them in a groove while still lowering the fatigue. I had on the previous slide that fatigue masks fitness. So we want to be able to drop the fatigue down in order to let the athlete express their full fitness. All right, so start getting your questions in. I just want to say too, like if you feel overwhelmed by all of this, I know I threw a lot at you. I'm expecting you to be able to refer to stuff later. I'm also readily available by email and have more resources, so I would love to hear from you. I reply to everything in my inbox, so please let me know if we don't get your question in the next 10 minutes. We are going to be done at a hard stop, and then again, yeah, if you feel overwhelmed by this, I think remember the key takeaways that we started with and then come back to the details later. So use the off season to teach the fundamentals. If you don't have an off season, then teach fundamentals in the preseason if possible, or in season if necessary. And think about that more from the perspective of physical education than from strength and conditioning training. So you're really teaching, especially high school athletes, you're teaching them how to move and laying the groundwork for future strength training more than you are like getting the immediate performance benefit from it. If you have an off season or at least a preseason, then start to speed up rate of force development and prepare for 2K racing as you come into the spring. They need that base of strength and coordination, but then they can start doing plyos and 2x tempo as soon as they kind of have the basics down. And then once you get in season, don't get fancy with the strength training. Just focus on keeping athletes healthy, which means available to practice and race and get good strokes in the boat, and then at least maintaining what we did in the prior phase of training. And you can do this in a number of ways depending on the parameters of your program, from just a full body land warm up to the more minimalist sessions if you don't have gym access, or one of the in-season program templates that I shared if you do have gym access. So open floor for questions. I can go back to any slides if there's anything that people want to go over more. And let's see.
We do have 2 questions in the Q&A.
Yep.
The first one is, what do you think of utilizing cleans in high school strength training programs as a holistic movement that's relatively comparable to the rowing stroke?
Yeah, let me pull something up here because I had Olympic lifts penciled in here originally and then took them out because I was worried about packing too much in. But let me pull up the graphic that I had for that. I will say just while I'm loading this that I prefer to use the 2x tempo training and plyos versus Olympic lifting. Let me pull this up because I think that a picture will say 1,000 words in terms of helping demonstrate that. The thing about Olympic lifts is coming back to like having a limited amount of training time and also the goals of Olympic lifting. So Olympic lifts exist to teach and train this triple extension position on the left, but which is extension of the ankles, knees, and hips. But in rowing, I've got here in the middle, we only ever get basically single extension of the knees with partial extension of the hips and ankles. And then kind of my joke over here on the right is that the only time we do get true triple extension is extremely undesirable for performance. Um, I think the other thing about Olympic lifts, I've got my force curves here on the bottom, uh, rowing stroke on the left, Olympic clean and snatch here on these middle two. In an Olympic lift, we want to be much more patient off the floor and then accelerating through the mid phase of the pull through hip extension. But that's not necessarily how we coach rowing with more of an emphasis on foot pressure, get the blade in, get on it with the legs. So I tend to see athletes who have done a lot of Olympic lifting tend to struggle with a more patient uh, with taking that more patient power application from the Olympic lifting to a sharper power application on the rowing side. They tend to like kind of coast into it a little bit more, and that's not as relevant for the modern era. But I think in this middle picture here, the reason that I keep coming back to jumps and plyos is our jump curve looks very similar to our rowing stroke curve. So these are these dotted lines here. So when I look at the Olympic lifting, I think about the time that we have to teach athletes in order to do those skills well, the non-zero injury risk of, you know, if somebody misses a clean and they jam their wrist and then they can't feather, so they're out of a boat, the rowing coach is probably not very happy with me, unless we're going to say, well, this is so worth doing that it's worth whatever the risk is. And given the lack of, I think, physical carryover, I'm not totally sure that is there. So I think I will use an Olympic lift sometimes if the athletes are particularly skilled. Like if they come to us with that skill set already, then we can keep using Olympic lifts without having to invest all the teaching and training time. But when I only have 2 sessions a week or maybe 3 sessions a week with athletes, I'm spending more of my time on the explosive tempo coaching and the plyometric work.
And we have another question, which is, what do you recommend for athletes that do not join the team until 4 to 6 weeks before water regattas due to other commitments? How do you effectively catch them up to others on the team who have been training since January, and prevent injury?
Yeah.
Two
If
fun
it's
stuff.
possible to have, if it's possible to have two groups, then you basically have like your late starters with your early starters, um, and you're working on maybe a little bit more remedial skills with the one group. I would love to think that if they have other commitments, then maybe they're learning skills through those other commitments. If they're multi-sport athletes, if they're getting strength and conditioning through something else, then it would certainly be nice to think that they're going to come maybe not totally ready to go in the rowing sense, but ready to go in a lot of other physiological senses. You know, I wrestled in the winter and then I rowed in the spring, because that gave me the same base of athleticism and a lot of conditioning for the 6 to 7 minute duration. So I had to catch up on the rowing side, but I was totally ready to go in the more physical ways. Um, 4 to 6 weeks isn't a lot of time to be able to get everybody up to speed on rowing. So I think then just you're shifting into more of a minimalist mode for the strength training side, making sure that they're staying healthy and teaching some basic coordination if they haven't gotten that from whatever they've been doing over winter. And then, the athletes who are prioritizing it for more than one season are the athletes who are usually gonna perform better. So if that becomes a priority for those athletes, then they're gonna train differently.
And for the next question, if you only had 20 minutes, either before or after your water practices to focus on strength maintenance, what movements would you prioritize?
Yeah, that's the full body warm up move. So I think they were going to start with something to get the ankles flexible. So we could do any sort of ankle mobility exercise to get athletes able to get to that deep catch position. We'll do some sort of a squat motion so that they're practicing that, some sort of a hinge motion. I think, we're just looking at like what are the physical skills that they're going to need on water? How can we prepare athletes to be able to do that? Uh, and then you could set up a pretty simple, PE style circuit of here's your ankle station, here's your squat station, here's your hinge station, glute activation station, core. You could do a push up or an elevated push up if the athletes need a little bit more help, less load. Something for the shoulders. So we might, if you have resistance bands, you could do a band pull apart. I've got a full body warm up. If you go on my website, rowingstronger.com, and in the complete guides section right there on the home page is a link to the warm up where you can see basically that. And then if we could try to do that, sorry, let me just add, if we could try to do that before practice, that's going to be better than after practice. And if you have, I'm looking at that question again, we can look at it just as the warm up side, or maybe if we had, 20 minutes isn't quite enough time. If we had 30 minutes, and maybe that's a little bit more time to be able to do one lift. If we have access to equipment, we could do some goblet squats or some front squats, some Romanian deadlifts or some sort of hinge exercise warm up, and then one exercise, maybe two exercises, and then you're moving on from there. But I think I'd be more inclined to underwork that by making sure they're getting in a full body warm up and being ready to row versus overwork and risk fatiguing the athletes too much or contributing to an overuse setting.
And then we have one last question, which is, what are your thoughts on weekly time tests, 2K or 3K in the preseason to see if athletes, see progress with athletes? Would it be more important to use that time for more beneficial exercises?
Uh, yeah, I probably if I do a weekly test, this is going a little bit outside of my strength coach lane. Um, but if we're doing a weekly test, I'd probably do something much shorter duration. A weekly 2K or 3K is pretty brutal from a mental perspective to be able to bring it like that each week. But I've used a 7 stroke max or a 10-second test or something like that where we're looking at like what is the peak power output that the athlete can put down. That's my favorite way to see carryover from strength training. I'd rather not test rep maxes because I've rowed with people who could squat a lot, or I've lifted with people who could squat a lot of weight who I wouldn't want to row with. But we can actually see that carries over to how they actually put the power down on the erg or on the water. If we could do, a minute for max or something like that, that gets us an answer on what their peak power potential is. And that's going to be a lot less fatiguing and stressful for the athlete too in a weekly context. But otherwise, I think, what matters is being fast towards the end of the season when you're into your qualifiers and your championships, not so much how fast you are in the preseason, where I think to the person who asked the question, if you're sacrificing training time for testing, then that might not be the best way to do it in the preseason when you really want to be using that time to build up for later in the season where you want to be fast.
I think that was our last question, but if anyone has any more questions, you can drop them in the chat. Um,
I
and
guess I was more efficient with my slides than I was prepared. Yeah, if anybody wants to like go back over something, let us know in the chat or in the Q&A. Or if you have any other questions about anything else in strength training, I'm certainly happy to take them. Or we could start our lunch breaks 15 minutes early before the next round of
yeah,
presentations.
um, And I think Will's email is on sketch.com. So anyone who would like to reach out can reach out with further questions. But if we don't have any more questions, then I think we'll go into the lunch break a little bit sooner, or actually give you a longer break before our next talk. Really appreciate everyone being here with us on a Saturday, and hopefully you enjoyed this talk and your next talks are just as good. Oh, but we do have a raised hand, so I think we have one more question before we go.
Yep. Yep.
So we have, how many exercises would you recommend during a strength session?
Let's go back to the template. So we go back to our basic training template here. I think, rowers always going to be able to work for longer than they are harder. So sort of what I really want to do is like do a different stimulus for what the athlete's already getting from doing meters and minutes and hours of erging and rowing. So here, we pick one or two plyometric exercises, do it with a squat or a hinge, and then I like a circuit of a push, a pull, and then another lower body exercise. We'll pick one from each of those and train them for two or three sets if we're in season, or maybe we go to 3 or 4 sets if we're off season or preseason. And then one exercise each of lateral or rotational hip, shoulder, and core. And then we're done in, 45 to 60 minutes usually. Sometimes if the athlete needs more time to work up or warm up, as you get stronger, it takes more time to get all the plates on the bar. So that might take up to 75 minutes for some of our stronger athletes doing longer training sessions. But most of our senior team athletes are done in 60 to 75 minutes, including warm up time. And when I was coaching the Western college program, I learned how to do this because we had 1 hour of strength training time in the gym. So we would literally we would get there 15 minutes early, do our warm up in the hallway of the gym so that we could get in and do the session in 60 minutes and make sure that we were done. So that was a 45 to a 60-minute session depending on how you count that with the warm up time. And I didn't find that we needed to do more because the athletes are already doing more. Any energy and time beyond that tends to go into rowing, erging, recovering, working on their school or job or whatever else they have doing. So I'm really kind of more focused on a minimum effective dose and getting the most out of a more limited training dose rather than just kind of training more and more and more. So I think if we count these up, that's what, about 8 or 9 exercises, depending on how you want to do with the plyos. I think if you're doing 2 60-minute strength training sessions per week, you're in a very good spot for developing enough strength, power, and muscle mass to be good at rowing. We can wrap up there then, and thanks Flavia for your management, and thanks to everybody else for being here, and hope you have a good rest of your day and preseason and in-season phases.